Good afternoon. My name is Dalia Habib-Linson. I'm the head of academic engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and I'm delighted to welcome you, our guests, and our terrific panelists to the second of 3 discussions, Artist, Student, Curator, Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Design Now. This new series explores how artists, designers, and communities of creative production have been impacted by and are responding to the multiple crises of now. From the current and intensifying global health pandemic and correlated economic uncertainty to heightened social and emotional tensions as a result of ongoing racial injustice in the United States and across the globe. These interconnected ruptures have not only forced dramatic shifts in the way artists, designers, students, and museum professionals work, but they've revealed long entrenched fault lines in our social and institutional structures. In our conversation tonight, we'll explore how the work of designers has responded to this moment of crisis and the nature of emergency itself. In the context of the museum, we recognize a unique responsibility to creating a space for open dialogue in this moment. And we see tonight's discussion as a real opportunity to listen and to engage with these issues through multiple perspectives. So before brief introductions, I'd like to share a little bit about the structure of the program. The format is open conversation, which will be followed by time for questions and discussion with the audience. And you may have gathered by now that we're using a webinar format, which means that while you'll be able to see and hear the presenters, we will not be able to see or hear you, although please don't let that deter you from participating. We very much invite you to submit questions using the Q&A button that looks like a speech bubble in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Questions and comments will be visible to the presenters, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Finally, please note that today's session is being recorded and captioning will be available at a later date to coincide with the recording. With that, I really want to thank my colleagues at the museum, Michelle Millar Fisher, who I'll introduce in a moment, Sophia Walter, Reto Turing, and Achille Tomasito in collaborating on this series together. And I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists today. So Paola Antonelli, maybe you could just wave, Paola, let us know it's you, hello, is Senior Curator at the Museum of Modern Art in the Department of Architecture and Design, as well as MoMA's founding director of research and development. Her most recent exhibition, Neri Oxman, Material Ecology, opened at MoMA in February of 2020. She is also currently working on an iteration of Broken Nature that will be on view at MoMA starting in the fall of 2020. And on @design.emergency, an Instagram and book project on the role of design in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in collaboration with critic Alice Rawthorn. Alexis Hope, hi Alexis, is a designer and researcher based at the MIT Media Lab and MIT Center for Civic Media. Among other projects, she has served as the design director for Make the Breast Pump Not Suck project, an effort to bring together a diverse community to hack technology, policy, and systems in support of breastfeeding parents and babies. Michelle Millar Fisher is the is the Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Her work investigates the confluence of power, people, and all forms of design, decorative arts, and craft. Previously, she's worked at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. Her current project with design historian Amber Winnick is at Designing Motherhood on Instagram. She's the co-founder of Art and Museum Transparency. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we're really delighted to get started with our conversation. So if I may turn it over to you, Michelle, to begin our questions.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction, Dalia. Can everyone hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
If at any point my microphone shuts off in any way, it was having a bit of difficulty just beforehand, put it in the chat and I'll make sure that I deal with it. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Dahlia, and it's so lovely to be with Paola and Alexis today. I have to say that this is just wonderful company to be in. Paola, if I do anything good in design ever, it's because you were my teacher. So I am really delighted to be in your company. And Alexis, the things that I'm researching just now come directly out of being inspired by you. So we're in really fierce company this evening. We're here to talk about, and I've got some images, but we can start chatting and see if we need them. We're here to talk about the intersections, the many intersections of design and different forms of emergency. And so before we hone in on some of the things that you're working on, both just now in your own practices, I'd love to be able to contextualize for the folks who are listening today and who will leave lots of room for conversation and questions with the ways in which you've come to this work, so kind of context for it. And Paola, I wondered if I could start with you. Before you come to your current projects, and I know we could think of many ways in which you've done this over a really long and expansive career, but are there one or two examples that you can talk about in terms of ways in which you've looked at the intersections of design and different forms of kind of urgent issues, social, political, economic, design-wise?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me, and especially Michelle. I'm going to reveal your hidden email. Well, I've always seen design as politics. You know, I'm Italian, so in Italy, you talk about politics at dinner, like soccer and football and politics. And I was very stunned when I came here because people think that speaking about politics is kind of rude and you don't do it at the dinner table. So to me, it's always been life. Everything that's outside of the family is politics, even in the family. So design is politics and design is life. So it concerns what's going on in the world. So every single exhibition that I've done, even the ones that, well, maybe one I can think that was not about that, but they have been about the real world and real life. So there's two examples that I can think of that really, actually three that really concern today. One is an exhibition that I did in 2005 called Safe, Design Takes on Risk. It was an exhibition that explored how design, how designers almost take a Hippocratic oath. That's what I used to think then, and then I'll tell you about the rest in the future. But at that time, it was about designers taking care of keeping people safe and comfortable. But the funny thing is that safe came from a previous idea called emergency that I was working on in the year 2000. I started in the year 2000. It was all about emergency equipment, ambulances, fire trucks, triage centers, you name it. And I was working on it until September 11th happened, and I was paralyzed and frozen, and I just dropped everything as if it were burning my hands and didn't want to talk about it anymore. And after a few months, I started thinking about it again, also prompted by people on the outside, designers. But I started looking at, instead of the reactive side of design in front of emergency. It's okay. It was just, there was some interference from my computer. I'm sorry. So instead of looking at the reactive side of design in front of emergency, I started looking at the preventative and proactive side. So safety. So that's an idea, one example. Another example is one that Michelle was very, very central and crucial to, which is a project called Design and Violence. So I told you how I thought designers would take a Hippocratic oath. Well, not really. Yeah, there it is. A few years later, when the 3D printed gun was announced, I had this. I have to try and stop my computer. My computer is trying to get into my headset. I'm going to try to stop it. And so, yeah, so it was, the 3D printed gun happened. And I just, once again, like 9/11, I was stopped in my tracks. Sometimes these things happen that make me rethink everything. Now, the person that conceived the 3D printed gun was not a designer. Cody Wilson is not a designer. He was a philosopher. Now he's also like a sex offender, I think, at this point. I don't know, but it's like really, he's gone the whole spectrum spectrum. But it made me really think, because I used to think that 3D printing, like any other technology that helps designers, was a force for good. And then I realized that no, there's an ambiguity to design and a responsibility to design that needs to be acknowledged. So together with my co-curator, Jamer Hunt, who's always my favorite partner in crime, we proposed an exhibition to MoMA. MoMA said no to the exhibition, and I kind of can understand why, but at that time I was really angry about that. So Jamer and I did what you do when you want to do something without asking for manual permission. We started a WordPress site, and at first we were doing it with his researchers at Parsons. Then MoMA saw that it was a good thing, gave us some money. To make a long story short, we could count on Kate Carmody first, curatorial assistant there, and then on Michelle, which was fantastic because Kate and Michelle just made the platform take off. And every week or every other week, we would pick an object that had an ambiguous relationship with violence, from a map that marked all the DDoS attacks on the internet worldwide, to ninja stars, to there were so many that I cannot even think about right now, to the redesign of the slaughterhouse by Temple Grandin. And then we would have an authority talk about, write a little essay. Then we would have an introduction that was very curatorial. And then at the end, the most beautiful thing is that we would ask a question. So to give you just an example, I'm taking a lot of time, but I'll be quick. The redesign of the slaughterhouse by Temple Grandin, we had Ingrid Newkirk write the essay. Ingrid Newkirk is the president of PETA, the Society for the Protection of Animals. And she said, well, if we really have to kill animals, let's kill them well. You know what I'm saying? She was very pragmatic, but also very sensitive. It was a beautiful essay. And at the end, the question was, can we redesign a violent act to be more humane? And we had more than 150 comments and responses. So we transformed something that in a gallery would have been one way only into a two-way street of real dialogue that then became also public programs, Oxford style debates, and the book that Michelle showed that MoMA published. So that was really a sense of urgency that Michelle, Jamer, and Kate and I had to really discuss this, to show how design could help us understand the manifestations of violence in contemporary society. And I'll stop here, but these were two examples to answer your question.
That's awesome to have that context. Paola, I'd love to come back to you, and I will in another question, the ways in which you have always used digital means to expand the notion of what curatorial work around design is. And we can send out, after the program is over this evening, links to some of these projects because they still have an afterlife online. And I think it's interesting to think at this moment in time, the way in which we are forced to work so digitally, there's really sort of a long history of you doing that within your practice, which I think now many others are sort of moving towards. But Alexis, first of all, I want to ask you a little bit about contextualizing your work. If you can tell us just a little bit about how you come to do what you do before we start to talk about some more concrete projects.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be part of this conversation. So my background is in product design with a kind of particular focus on digital and interaction design for health and educational technologies. So I worked for several years on a project to design a portable ultrasound system for midwives in East Africa. So that was a really formative project for me. But over the past few years, my work has shifted a little bit from designing things themselves to designing experiences and support structures for other people to design things. So one of those projects, I'm the design director for the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck project, which you mentioned. And so that kind of manifests as a series of hackathons, which are kind of like design jams for tech folks. And these hackathons really invite people together to redesign technologies, policies, and systems in support of breastfeeding and postpartum health in the United States. So a lot of this work kind of involves making design decisions that help people, sometimes hundreds of people at a time, come together and build relationships and coalitions across lines of many kinds of difference, racial, socioeconomic, and gender difference. And we kind of do this through a combination of bringing together equity design principles and also creating really joyful, creative, and playful spaces for people to engage in very serious topics. What Paola said about kind of pushing against institutions in some ways really resonated with me, because in terms of what's at the core of what I do or my approach, I really like to playfully push institutions that claim to invent the future to make space for concerns and perspectives that they historically haven't. So in our case, we were hosting events about breastfeeding, about racial disparities in pregnancy and postpartum outcomes, and about paid family leave policies. And those are very unusual conversations to have at a place like MIT, which is kind of a bit politics phobic sometimes, as Paola was talking about. But in my view, having those conversations are an essential part of like what it actually means to invent a more equitable future. So I think they just must be had. And then lately, I've kind of found it useful in my work to think about my position inside of an institution as a material for design in itself. So that kind of often looks a lot like power redistribution, or thinking about like how can I leverage my affiliation to an institution like MIT to connect people who are already innovating in their own communities with the resources that a place like MIT has access to, whether that's financial, technical, or media oriented. And I've kind of found a bit of like fun and joy around doing that type of work lately.
So I'm going to come back in a second, Alexis, and we're going to look at some of the images of the hackathon itself. But Paola, I wondered if you could talk now a little bit about the Design Emergency Project.
Yeah.
Flesh out how that came into being. And I watched the amazing Instagram Live. I've watched many of them, but with Marco Ranieri today, we're talking about how that's manifested as a project.
Well, first of all, Alice Rawthorn and I have been friends for decades, and we respect each other tremendously. But we have never done something together that was not like a panel or a lecture, and we really wanted to. And Alice has been running for years now an amazing Instagram series. I'm sure that all of you that are online that deal with design know about it. Every week she takes a different theme and she posts every day a mini essay that is researched in a scholarly and journalistic way, at the same time in depth, perfectly written, with sometimes never seen pictures. So it is a resource for designers that is truly precious. And, you know, I've always admired and I've always been a little jealous of it, but yeah, okay, you know, we're good. We're good enemies and good frenemies. No, we're not. We really are friends. And so when the pandemic started, she started a series, Designing a Pandemic, that was much longer than just a week. She started, we're now, I think it's at episode 70. And at the same time, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was being invited to do all these Instagram Live, and I was seeing other people doing Instagram Live, and I was thinking, it's kind of easy. And it's something that Alice and I could do together in a second. And so I told her, and she said, well, yeah, we could do this, and we could pick really the best people that we could ever talk with, and then we can do a book. So it just became this avalanche just by wanting to do something together. And the format really is that. I mean, Alice and I have the same agenda in life, which is to show how amazingly important design is, and how it manifests in so many different ways, and how it's not only curly cute chairs and cars and posters. So this was a perfect opportunity. A very objectively complicated and urgent situation worldwide, where everybody had to put all hands on deck. And so we started, at this point, it's about 9 weeks ago. We've done like 8 episodes, I think. And the people that we interviewed on Instagram Live range from Alyssa Eckert, who's the illustrator at the CDC that co-designed the image of the coronavirus that we all know, the Hellraiser with the red S proteins. And that, oh, you're bringing it up. Perfect. Here it is. Thank you so much. And then we have, let me see, who else do you have there in the PowerPoint? So I can, okay, then we have this, you see there, that's Mark Dalton, the yellow and white signage. That's the New Zealand campaign to promote awareness and behavior and sensible and responsible behavior among citizens in New Zealand, which we consider the best of these different campaigns that have happened. happened. Today, I spoke with Marco Ranieri, as Michelle said. Marco Ranieri is an anesthesiologist and an expert in ICU and pulmonology. That is one of the barriers, because there's been more than one, inventors of the split ventilator that can treat two patients at the same time. So he was able, he's in Italy, so not only he has a knack for design and engineering, but also there's all these like family-based companies that can churn out a prototype in the matter of like 20 hours. And so in the span of 2 days, he was able to have this like double ventilator active. And so we spoke with him today. And then every now and then, Alice and I do double acts on different themes. We did one on hacking, so all the hacking that happened because of the pandemic. We did one on information design and the different types of information that went out, on the symbolism of the COVID-19 crisis, going from Italian housewives singing with their pots and pans on the balconies every night at 7 to, once again, you know, images of kids like this one doing physical distancing, utilizing material culture of their own region. So it's been really a delight, and it has enabled us to really flex our muscle and also use our power, because that's something that we're always aware of. We have reached, you know, Alice and I are possibly two of the most well-known people in our field. So we feel that we can really make a difference in making people understand that design is a force to be reckoned with, and also a very important ingredient of any kind of progress that is at this point not just desired but necessary, because the world is already a much different place than what it was before.
And Alexis, I've got a couple of images of your work here too, which I want to move to very quickly so that you can speak to them and maybe just expand a little bit on what you talked about with the breast pump hackathon. Two of them now, which have happened, one in 2014, one in 2018, and then you have another hackathon coming up this fall. And so I remember you telling me, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this, the way that you moved from thinking about the breast pump as an object of study, a design object that maybe needed to be rethought, to thinking along much broader terms and where you came to.
Yeah, maybe a bit of brief history about how the project came to be would kind of help tell that story. Because it originally sort of came from a conversation with my colleague, Catherine D'Ignazio, and I. She's now a professor at MIT and leads the Data and Feminism Lab. But she was in grad school at that point, and she had just had her third baby while she was in grad school. And we just got to talking one day, as you do, about what that experience was like for her. And she told me this story about using a breast pump and sitting on the floor of our fancy design building to use this object, and basically detailing to me all the reasons why it was just a terrible, terrible device, and also why kind of the social context of using that device inside of our workplace was a bad experience for her. So we kind of originally set out to think that we ourselves might redesign a breast pump. So we started with the object. And we had a small gathering at the Media Lab, mostly kind of new parents in the building. Some people's midwives came. It was a small gathering. And Catherine wrote a blog post at the end of our event, kind of detailing some of the ideas we had and where we wanted to go. And she had a line at the end of it that said, "Oh, if you have any ideas for improving the pump, send us an email." And we honestly didn't expect very many emails or anyone to sort of really care about this topic, because we actually had some trouble getting the Media Lab as a whole to make space for this topic. But long story short, we got over 1,000 emails in a week from people all over the country, mostly moms who were maybe up at 2 a.m. pumping themselves, who gave us sort of detailed ideas for how we might improve it. And so it was like, at that point, we decided to sort of take a step back and think about how we might open up this design effort to include more people. So that was kind of our first step. And so we had the 2014 hackathon, and that first hackathon really was largely focused on artifacts and objects, new kinds of breast pump cozies to deal with the noise, architectural interventions in terms of where people might pump. And we kind of had this vague idea at the time. I think we offhandedly said, "Oh, if you want to hack policy, like, go for it, because that also sucks too, the fact that there's no paid family leave in this country. And so nobody really took us up on the challenge in 2014. I think we didn't really know how to scaffold that conversation, and that's not the lens we were originally taking with the project. But kind of fast forward a few years later, reflecting on the event, broadening our team, and really learning more about the racial and socioeconomic disparities at play in terms of who actually gets to breastfeed in this country. So we usually frame it as sort of like a personal choice whether to breastfeed or not, but it's actually sort of like a luxury good in terms of who actually has the time and ability to do that. So there are many disparities in terms of access. So we kind of reconceptualized the 2018 event with our larger team to have a focus on equity and to sort of broaden out. We had a hackathon in one room, and then we had a policy summit in the other room that was focused on paid family leave and the lack of it in the United States and how we might change that. So it really became this conversation about, yes, technology, yes, artifacts and services and systems and services, but also systems. And we need to have designers move to a place where they have this sort of systemic literacy about sort of all the reasons why using a breast pump might suck and all the things that symbolize. So we started to try and get our technologists to, and we also had a research project led by our colleague Kate Krontiris, and she interviewed parents from all across the United States about their breastfeeding experiences, and we put it together in this publication that we distributed to everyone at the event so that they would have sort of a range of different experiences to draw from in terms of getting the full picture of what that could be like in the United States.
Yeah, and what struck me about this publication, I love it so much, Alexis, I go back to it again and again as like a good benchmark for the types of research that I want to aspire to do. But you tell so many different types of stories, or you allow people to tell their own different types of stories, I should say. And it struck me also that at your hackathons, there was a really deep process of inviting and welcoming and sort of building out a community that was deeply intersectional as well as interdisciplinary, which is one of the hallmarks of your research and at the lab. So we now have really good context for the amazing work that you are both doing in terms of how design grapples with urgent issues and how design intersects with emergency in your work just now. And I know that we're in a very specific moment where we're dealing with what is often now called twin pandemics, both of COVID, but also of structural racism. And so we're dealing with this both very sort of immediate moment where people are fearful of a disease that might hit them in terms of their own sort of health, but also a moment in time where we are now in very unique and individual ways reckoning with structural racism. For some folks, this is something that has just been absolutely part of their daily lives. And then for others, it's something that is an awakening. Sometimes a welcome one, sometimes a very rude awakening. And we are experiencing it with the overlay of massive partisanship in pretty much every aspect of our lives. And Alexis, you said something that really interested me, and I think it's also the way in which you work in many ways, Paola, though correct me if I'm wrong, that you think about your position in an institution as a material for design. So thinking about power redistribution, or thinking about how you can be that kind of grain in the sand, in the cog in the wheel, so you can sort of offer that point of friction. And I think that's one of the ways in which both of your works really gains the traction that it does and does the powerful things that it does too. So I wonder if you, with that in mind, can answer the very simple question, how do you grapple with who gets to decide what an emergency is in the field of design and more broadly sort of within our society? Because we're dealing with emergencies that have been as old as time, and also emergencies that are, maybe 3 months old in terms of the pandemic. But we're also dealing with the power structures that enable some folks to highlight things and others' voices to not be platformed in some ways. So how do you grapple with that as an ethics in your own research? And who wants, should I nominate someone to go first? Or Paola, would you be able to take it? Or Alexis, yeah, go for it. Go for it, Alexis, yeah.
Okay. As you were talking, I was just kind of thinking that I think some emergencies are invisible to people with a lot of power. And so I was just thinking about that, sort of the work of myself and my collaborators in terms of the maternal health work. It's kind of operated in a context where 1 in 4 people who give birth in the United States go back to work within 10 days before they may have even healed. We have no paid family leave in the United States to support families. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience preventable maternal death compared with white women. So these things represent an ongoing crisis for many people. And then sort of when you add in the pandemic, the way I've been thinking of it lately is just kind of like it's adding layers of emergency. I've been talking to some of the organizations we collaborate with who provide community support services, like the awesome, you should look them up, listeners, Black Mothers Breastfeeding Association in Detroit. And so they're sort of figuring out how do they do all the work that they normally already do to try and reduce disparities with the added layer of pandemic. So it's just kind of complicating things.
And I want to add one more organization for people to take a look at. It's the one that we're working with for Designing Motherhood, called the Maternity Care Coalition. And out of all of the responses that people have made to the murder of George Floyd and racial inequity in the US, and also the pandemic, so this twin pandemic, it's been organizations like the one you mentioned in Detroit, Alexis, like Maternity Care Coalition, who have put forth the most authentic and visionary ways to deal with it, and have put out statements, I think, that actually speak to the fact that many folks have been dealing with emergencies for a very, very long time, and have expertise, have ways in which, you know, design or otherwise, we might begin to think about some of these structural inequities that we deal with, and have been truly inspiring to think about in this particular moment. But Paola, how do you deal with that as an ethics?
Well, two things before that. You have been throwing it like that there, but you're working on a book called Designing Motherhood. You haven't even talked about it, but it's like, so yeah, I just wanted to explain that because otherwise people wouldn't know. And then the second thing that I wanted to talk about was the concept of twin pandemics. I would never want to call systemic racism a pandemic, because a pandemic comes from something other, a virus, and instead the systemic racism is from within ourselves. Therefore, it's a cancer. I mean, I remember reading that beautiful book that is The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who used to say that we don't get cancer, we are cancer. It's our cells that mutate. So systemic racism, we can't just have a vaccine or an antiviral medication. It has to be really an immunotherapy and a mutation of our DNA. So it's really fascinating, and it's an emergency that's been simmering for centuries, but because of the power structure that exists right now, it has not been addressed. And I believe now I'm gonna get to also the answer. This was a preamble to the answer. I think that who decides what's an emergency? Well, I think it's my job within an institution like MoMA to point out what would be relevant for us to do. But as you know very well, these institutions are very complex, and there are needs that are definitely about the mission and about culture, and then there are some others that are about keeping the doors open and the lights on. So we always need to modulate what we do, and I have been lucky enough as to be able to address these emergencies that I perceived as such, and then were revealed as such also by the community, by the citizens, and by the world. I've been lucky enough as to do it many times. Michelle, you know very well how tough it is sometimes, because we work together. You know, sometimes you have to struggle, but on the other hand, I've always been enabled to do it one way or the other. I have antennas. That's one of the few things that I know how to do, is to perceive what's going on in the world and what's an emergency. That's been my superpower. And so even though I'm very humble and I want to listen to what other people say, but I trust my guts a lot when it comes to feeling emergencies. I have to say that lately I have been really impressed, deeply impressed by people that are younger than me. I'm 57. I've been so impressed by people that are in their 20s and that are marching in the street. I'm I've been really impressed by their relentlessness. Instead of doing those protests of 3 million people that happen once and then are forgotten, they march every day 3 times in hundreds, making a lot of noise. They're organized, they have a very clear message. So I think that from now on we'll know what the emergencies are, because they're going to tell us.
Dalia, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have too, if you have. And then folks who are listening, if you want to put any questions that you have in the chat, we're sort of getting to about 25 minutes before the hour. So if you'd like to join us, ask any questions, then we can make sure that they get to Alexis and Paola. I also want to ask a little bit about how the projects that you have been received, what kinds of conversations that you've had with either audiences or participants or folks that you have engaged in the work that you're doing. And so, and when you're engaging folks, who are they? How are you bringing stakeholders, communities, or designers into conversation with this intersection between design and emergency? And Alexis, maybe I can ask you in terms of how you're sort of working, especially in an online version, because I know how much community is sort of at the core of what you do with the hackathon. How are you having to change things a little bit in terms of your working methods?
Yeah, it's a tough time to be in the business of doing work that brings people together for large in-person design gatherings. So unsurprisingly, my collaborators and I have been trying to figure out how to pivot the work to this new reality. So we had been working on an in-person Feminist Futures hackathon in October, but it's now going to be a virtual experience. I guess like lots of many other designers in this moment, I've kind of spent the past few months reckoning a bit with the limitations of design as a discipline to address some of these challenges, and with my own limitations as a human trying to live through this moment too. So I'm still kind of at the beginning of like working to move through that to do something that feels really generative, because it was a bit of a painful design pivot at first, the move to a virtual space, and in part because it kind of forced me to come to terms with the world as it is and not how I wish it were. But all that said, I do think it's a moment to really double down on figuring out how to build community in this and build new relationships at a distance, because I think so many of us are feeling much more socially isolated than usual, much hungrier to participate in making social change. So I guess we have lots of different ideas about how we might adapt. Hackathons are usually like a 24 to 48 hour concentrated in-person thing where everyone's building off of each other's energies. So it's very hard to translate that. But one of the things we're trying to do, which might make it less like a hackathon and more like some new thing that hasn't existed yet, is to kind of take more of a slow burn approach. So we are going to have the event unfold over the course of a month. We're going to pay people stipends to participate in this kind of experience over the month. So I think asking anyone to do any sort of labor right now for free does not make sense. It never does, but especially now. And I'm hoping that this sort of, and I want to maybe send people some physical things in the mail, so maybe some prototyping materials or other things like that to try and connect physical and virtual space. But yeah, there's lots of different ideas we have how to make it differently. But I think the biggest value add of hackathons to me are just the relationships they generate. And so that's like the crucial design question for me. Like, what are the choices I need to make to facilitate people like actually genuinely meaningfully connecting with one another in a difficult time?
And this is happening in the fall of 2020. So where do people watch out if they want to become involved or to participate or to watch along?
We're going to open up an application process, I think, in late summer. So I guess I would probably just recommend checking my Twitter. I'm at Alexis Hope, and I'll probably post some information about that then.
And so Paola, design emergency, it's not only the content that's sort of thinking about the current emergency of the COVID pandemic, but also the form that's been dictated by the pandemic too, because it is predominantly online. And I wondered if you can contextualize a little bit about how your practice has for a very long time incorporated digital platforms. We can go back through many of the exhibitions that you've done, and there's always been a really important designed platform, web platform, or digital component to them. And I'm wondering what's different, or maybe there isn't difference this time around, but what's different about using Instagram as a platform and the way in which you and Alice are thinking about design emergency, rather than, for example, Design and Violence, which was an online website, or also took place over Twitter, or Design in the Elastic Mind and the web platform for that. How has what you've done to date influenced what you're doing with Design Emergency, and what are the similarities and differences there?
Well, the internet has evolved, and the way we use it has evolved. Like the first website that I ever had, and that MoMA ever had, was in 1995. It was Newton Materials in Contemporary Design, and at that time there was no MoMA website, so I coded it myself. It's still there. You can find it on the museum website. It's horrible, but you know what? I learned HTML and did it. So, and then I wanted to do that because every time you do an exhibition, the catalog has to close a long time before, so you never have the most updated checklist, and I wanted an archival, I wanted a checklist that would be accessible to everyone, so it was totally archival and dissemination material. Then slowly but surely it became a complement to the physical exhibition. So you had three spaces for the exhibition: the gallery, the catalog, and the website. And so websites became works of design on their own. And Michelle mentioned Design in the Elastic Mind. I'm so proud of that website. It's gorgeous. It's Flash-based, but you can still look at it. It was designed marvelously, and you can figure everything out there. At some point then, I decided to use online. I was tired of doing that, and instead, not only me, everybody, we all migrated to a different use of the internet, and it became really for dissemination. So at that point, it was still an alternative space, but it became something other. So when we did Design and Violence, that was not an attempt to mimic an exhibition online. No, it was its own thing. So when people say, oh, it was an online exhibition, I always say, no, it was an online curatorial project. And then, of course, there's social media and how you use social media. And it's really funny because social media really reveal your own personality, either as an individual or as an institution, how many times you say I, how many times you take selfies, what you show, do you publish your own pictures or somebody else's? You know, it's really fascinating to see how people use them. And why did Alice and I choose Instagram? Well, it was a platform that we already knew, Alice in a masterful way, me in a much more disorganized way, but it was the Instagram Live that attracted us. Then other people told us you should have a YouTube channel. And frankly, I gotta tell you, I've already told Alice, I am hoping that this Design Emerges will go on forever. I mean, we can be like Ab Fab, you know, it's like, or Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. I really am dreaming that we, or what you should wear. No, I don't remember what not to wear. I hope that we will be able to be a duo forever, because I'm having a great time. But really, I always think of all these different entities, social media, websites, as spaces, because they are spaces. That's why I don't really miss that much the exhibitions right now. I miss the other side of my work at MoMA, which are the salons, the MoMA R&D salons. I miss the public programs. Those I miss, because I agree with Alexis. Online is not the same as in person. And for some things, I don't care about the physical reality anymore, but for the salons, I mean, right now you're all listening to us, you're sending the questions in the chat box, but boy, it would be so great if I could say to you, no, that question is not good enough. You over there, you know, with the red shirt. It makes a big difference. Also, maybe it's because I just want to show off, you know, and I like acting, but it's very different, the kind of like energy that you get from the audience.
You made a massively great segue into being able to ask and answer some of these questions that have come in, and thank you to everyone who has been sending them in. And maybe Dahlia, you and I can trade off. So sure. I'll pick one, or do you have one that you would like to start with?
Oh no, certainly I can start at the top if you'd like.
Great, go for it.
Okay. There's a question from a friend to many, Achille Tomasino, who says, thank you for your thoughtful contributions to this discussion. Special greetings to my former MoMA colleagues and current MFA colleagues. Hello, Achille. Given the manner in which you all frame design as a moral issue, have you monitored ways that design, even or especially good design, has been mobilized during the pandemic for evil?
I have a thought, but and maybe
yeah, go for it, Michelle.
I mean, I come from Scotland where healthcare is free. And so while I really have been so struck by the individuals who have been working within healthcare institutions to do just absolutely amazing work that I obviously don't have the skills to do, but I probably also don't have the stomach to do, I've been really fascinated by that tension of watching the healthcare system here and understanding the amazing individuals that work within it, but understanding it as a system that's just deeply inequitable, whatever way you cut it. And, looking at the stories not only of the ways in which, as Marco was saying today, physicians have had to hack equipment to get it to work, but also understanding that because elective surgeries, for example, have been cut, folks are now getting laid off or fired from hospitals because their bottom line is being hit by the fact that they've not had surgeries, elective surgeries sort of wheeling in over the last couple of months. So it's a bit of a messy answer because I don't think that hospitals are ever held up as like paragons of good design by any means. But I've been thinking about that tension within the healthcare system, the ways in which I feel so inspired and just in awe of the folks who work within them, but also, horrified as ever by the ways in which they are spaces just for inequities to play out day on day on day. But I wonder, Paola or Alexis, if you have other thoughts about specific design examples.
Alexis, if you want.
It's a really good question. I guess I've been paying attention to a lot of the conversation around design and the sort of design and technology development in the sort of facial recognition space, and kind of inspired by my colleagues in the AI community for sort of stepping up as researchers and trying to sort of quash some lines of research that I think point towards bad design. So I think I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out what would be generative and positive for this moment, but also trying to keep a keen eye on what people are doing, especially in other fields related to technology and power that are important right now.
I have not seen anything used for straightforward evil. There's always a lot of ambiguity. So for instance, privacy is a concern when you have all these tracking apps that are very well designed, but they also feel very different in different parts of the world, much like interpersonal distance feels different in different parts of the world, right? So there are, Korea, people are willing to give up their privacy to have tracking apps that really kill the curve, right? And in other parts of the world, it's not acceptable. So I haven't seen that much good design used for evil. I've seen it used in an ambiguous way. And then I've seen a lot of hubris on the part of like these arrogant manufacturers like Tesla, or I don't name his name, but the guy that does vacuums, that said, oh yeah, we can do ventilators in a sec. And then, like they can improvise anything. And instead they were not able to, so.
I guess if we want to think at a really macro level, we might say that democracy right now with our current administration is being used only for evil, but that sort of gets us out of the wider design conversation. And so I want to go to Colin's question. There's some other great questions above it, and we might come back to those as well. But Colin has one that I think follows on really nicely from what you've both said, Paola and Alexis, just now. And I'm going to read it in full. So he says, thank you very much for the discussion. He's really interested on the panelists' thoughts on what the critic Kate Wagner has recently termed corona grifting, design projects that exist only as digital renderings, divorced from material reality, and can often be poorly considered, impractically aestheticized, or they override stated needs. So Wagner argues that the main goal of this kind of vaporware is not actually to propose solutions to pressing problems, but rather to get visibility for their designers on Instagram or Dezeen or these types of platforms where they're published publish, but they don't have any kind of critical commentary, and instead rather just sort of perpetuate a larger kind of capitalistic profiteering from crisis. So because you're sifting through so many different projects in the larger ecosystem of design, how do you prioritize the really substantive stuff? And how do you have thoughts particularly on this notion of sort of corona grifting, these projects that purport to do something helpful but really are not very well considered at all?
I really loved that Kate Wagner's piece. I saw it too. And you know what? I mean, I think that my job, your job, Michelle, especially because we're curators, is to stimulate people's critical sense so they can sniff immediately the vaporware. Alice and I do it all the time. You know, we look at hundreds of projects, people send them to us, and you can pretty much tell what's going to work. I mean, even in all the efforts for PPEs, which were granted much easier to produce than ventilators, you could kind of tell what was working. And even ventilators, you know, ventilators are very complex, but those efforts that were about temporary ventilators, so bridge ventilators that led the patient from home to the main ventilator, or that let the patient wait for the full-fledged ventilator, were really, you could see the ones that were working or not. So I think that crap is recognizable as crap in most cases. And, you know, sometimes there are designers that do beautiful work, and sometimes they polish it too much and you get suspicious, but you can tell when it's real and when it isn't. What do you think, Alexis?
Yeah. Have you come across any like real clunkers?
Yes, I think especially the hackathons themselves actually are often critiqued for this very same thing, sort of people producing these like flashy demos or things like that that are based on a very thin understanding of a problem space and don't really go anywhere after the event and maybe get a bunch of press. So I think about this a lot in my work in general, but just one of the strategies that I've tried to work through for myself is just being accountable to a larger community that you're in relationship with, who will kind of not allow that to happen, because the purpose of these events is to create things that live on and actually do make meaningful change. And so the people who are invested in making meaningful change, particularly to help address issues within the communities that they live in, are just not willing to let that kind of crap happen because it's too important.
Yeah. There's a great question that's come in from Kamal that I'd love to pose to both of you. And he or she or they ask, what are other ways to define design emergency? Talking about environmental crisis. And Paola, that really nicely relates to broken nature. But I think I'd love to hear from both of you too, because Alexis, when you're talking about things like maternal mortality, you're talking about these sustained, systemic, really long-term crises that are, to use one of your words, Paola, knotty, really, really complex in their origins and in their possible solutions. So what are there ways to sort of think about emergency when you're dealing with these much larger, long-standing crises? How did you think about the term emergency, or did you when you were doing Broken Nature, for example, Paola?
Well, emergency means something that stands up, right? So that comes off if you have a baseline, what people call normal, and then something emerges. So it's when you look at the horizon and you see what demands attention. So even though I don't want to be so etymologically correct, still you can see what's going on, and there are many crises going on at the same time right now. And the environmental crisis is tremendously important. It's continuing, even though our attention right now is attracted by other emergencies that are closer to us. There's that one looming at the horizon that has the power to really terminate us even more than the coronavirus can. So how do I deal with that? I do what I always do. I look for projects, for designers, for examples that are so good as to bypass all barriers and bypass all kinds of like languages and backgrounds, and really stimulate people into thinking in a different way. I try not to preach, but rather to attract through these Trojan horses as much emotion as possible. You know, so Michelle was mentioning Broken Nature. This is an exhibition that I organized last year together with Ala Tanir, Laura Mairan, and Erica Petrillo. It was the 22nd Triennale di Milano. It was all about the environmental crisis, and you know, it was very well attended. It made me happy, it made us all happy. But I just want to tell you, the one compliment and comment that I got a lot that made me understand how I need to operate in the future was that people from the audience, citizens, not only designers, told me that they were moved. So that's what I think is very powerful. If you're able to move people, then something will remain as a sediment in their soul and in their mind. So this is what I want to do. I want to move.
Hmm. And you both, I mean, you talked just then about barriers, Paola, and it reminds me, because I know, since I know you, that Broken Nature was a long-standing idea of yours that found fruition at the Triennale, but you'd been thinking about that for a long, long time, much like Design and Violence too. I know, Alexis, you've been thinking about many of these issues with Catherine and other collaborators. And sometimes, and in fact, a lot of the time, it's not that they happen in institutions, or it's not that they happen in direct opposition to institutions either, but they often need, one of the barriers that they need to push against and kind of roll over sometimes are institutions not that don't care about these ideas, but sort of maybe operate at a different pace. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, Paola, you're in the museum, Alexis, you're in the university, and they can be quite glacially paced at times, a little bit bureaucratic. They're not necessarily institutions that are set up to really respond to emergencies. And as we've seen during COVID, a lot of institutions are really kind of scrambling, and many of them have met the moment, but these are not places that are necessary sort of first responders when there are particular emergencies, either immediate or long-standing. And so I'm wondering if it's fair to say that one of the barriers that you sort of push against or move around are the institutions with which you work or within which you work.
Well, I don't know if it's really the institution that's a barrier. It's the methods or the kind of like stream projects of the institutions that are. Like, I can tell you that MoMA right now has been looking for ways to respond quickly. But you know, exhibitions, you can't. We plan 5 years in advance. We have budgets that are allotted, sponsors that are in line waiting. So we cannot do it that way. We have public programs. Now, because of the closure, we had to really go online full force. So even in that case, we found different first response ways. So, you know, I've been at MoMA 26 years, and I've had my moments of frustration, I've had my fights, but on the other hand, I've also grown wise and understood that they are difficult places, and of course you will always have to argue, but it's also very helpful if you understand how they work, so that you choose your battles so that you can win the war, and the battles that you cannot win inside, maybe you can win outside, as we did for Design and Violence, that then came back outside, inside, or Broken Nature.
I'm still learning that kind of like from you. Alexis, do you find the same? How, like, you've talked a little bit about your institutional relationship, but do you see it as barrier? Do you see it as like, as you were saying, sort of material for design?
Say it again. Oh yeah, you, Alexis, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was kind of thinking as you were talking that actually one of the impulses of MIT and the Media Lab, maybe in particular, is to want to jump in and do something right away and move quickly. So I actually think sometimes for hackers and technologists, it might be more a matter of convincing folks to like slow down or reconsider the process through which they decide how to act and what to do. So I think, yeah, there are times when tech can move really fast, and maybe it should slow down. So I think about that sometimes.
And then Dahlia, you were going to combine a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be thinking through this structure about how we look at the present moment and the future by taking in the perspectives of those who've been in the field for a while and those who are entering it right now. And so we've got a couple of questions related to advice that you all might give. One from a high school student who's wondering about the future of design for her generation and how it'll be shaped by this pandemic. And relatedly, advice that you might offer someone who's using their own platform to take part in helping with emergencies that are ever present today. So I don't know who might like to start with that, but if you could sort of look back on your younger selves, what might you say to one another?
Alexis. Do you want to say it, Alexis? Yeah, Alexis, you start.
Yeah, so
I just think all of our sort of ongoing, what I can imagine as design challenges all revolve around equity. So I would have liked earlier in my career to have absorbed some more ideas around design and equity. And beyond that, I'm kind of hoping for designers younger than me to actually help show me the way as well. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what the next generations have to say as well.
Is there one resource, if you were going to suggest one, Alexis, on design and equity? It doesn't have to be a book, but it could be a seminar that you took, something that really sort of helped concretize your own framework for thinking about that you could share?
Yeah, I think one great place to start, it's a Medium article by the Equity Design Collaborative. I think the title, if you Google search it, is Racism and Inequity Are Products of Design. They Can Be Redesigned. And so I think that article gives a great introduction to some of these principles.
Thank you. How about you, Paola?
Oh, well, there are many resources. And I was thinking as you were speaking, pretty much anything that Paul Preciado writes is stunning. There's an article that just came out, and I just really, it's always an eye-opener. So definitely his work. And then Alice's Instagram is amazing. She did a whole series about what was design and it was design and Black Lives Matter. That was fantastic. But she's been arguing for gender equality and for race equality for a long time, giving all these examples. So that's also quite excellent. And I'll think about it more. There are many. Last week there was this online seminar, Where Are the Black Designers? And it was excellent. Mm-hmm. So there are so many right now that I think we should almost collect them. You should do it. You should just collect resources for that. And in terms of giving advice, and how design will be in the future, this pandemic has accelerated things, has accelerated the move away from furniture, from the old design, the form follows function, or the vanity chairs that you can buy, towards instead design that is almost omnipresent in all the different facets of our life. A friend that used to work in the video game industry opened a new company that creates rooms for frontline responders to chill for a moment, right? So they're almost decompression rooms. So you use video game technology to treat PTSD. There's been the first video game that's prescribed by a doctor, which was just released. It's for kids that have ADHD. So the whole world of video games is great for designers, even designers that are socially engaged and that believe in equity. So it's not only for leisure. So opening up all these different doors to spaces that in the past were not considered per se design is very important. And also the fact that there are means of production right now that are more available even to smaller design companies makes them less dependent on bigger companies to hire them. So, but it's going to be a tough time. I'm not going to try to paint such a rosy picture. I mean, the pandemic's biggest effect, besides the tragedy of lives lost, is the terrible economical situation and the people that have lost their job and that will not get it back the way it was. So the creativity that people will have to exercise to design new ways of living and making a salary.
Yeah, and I would agree with the sort of essence of what you were both saying is also to say what you are seeing, to speak aloud, to somehow manifest it. And, that can be online, public programs, exhibitions within the world of curatorial or design. But I think one of the things I learned over the last year and a bit working with a collective called Art Museum Transparency was one of the things we did about a year and a half ago. And for folks who are not in the US, this might not seem particularly crazy, but in the US, there's a lot of taboo around just speaking your salary out loud. And we posted on our own Instagram channels, on our own social channels, what we made and invited other people to do the same. We were definitely not the first people to do it. And so Kimberly Drew had done it just before us, who was a former social media manager at the Met Museum and is a really fantastic public voice on a lot of things. And others had done it even before them as well. But there's a huge power in just being able to say aloud. And part of, I think, talking about equity in design, or the converse of that, exposing some of the inequities that we see, is about saying it when you see it, and also listening and amplifying the work of people who have been saying and seeing these things for a very long time. And so not necessarily needing to put your own words to it, but amplifying the very eloquent ones, the words, the designs, the other things that might exist out there. I know that we're getting close to the very end of our hour. I can't believe it's just shot by. And I want to say thank you to everyone in terms of the questions that you shared. Paola and Alexis, is there anything that you would like to close out with in terms of thoughts about the work that you're doing just now, or invitations for people to follow along with it?
Well, many people say that many people have been quoting the 1970s, and not only now, they have been doing it for a few years already, which I find very interesting. I was really too young in the 1970s, and I was in Italy, not here, but I remember it was terrorism. It was like really a period of sharp contrasts and of tension, a tension that could be destructive or could be productive. And I feel that I understand when people say the 70s, it could be that way. And especially they talk about the 70s in New York. And if you came to New York right now, you would see a city that is really wounded, that is strange and is slightly dirty and deserted at times. And Milton Glaser, who did the famous I Love New York logo, just died. And he did that logo because New York was in that situation in the 1970s, and the governor had hired an advertising agency to bring tourists back to New York and to Broadway. So I've been thinking a lot of those parallels. But after the 70s came a period that is not necessarily the best for social equity. I hope that instead we'll be able to challenge this energy this time to really make things better for all. I believe yes, and I believe yes because, and I'm going to speak like an old fart, but really that generation that I was describing before, I really have admiration for, and I really have a lot of trust in. So that's what I want to say. Keep doing what you're doing if you're listening. And if you are instead an old fart like me, support them.
Amen to that. Alexis, do you have any things that you would like to end with? Any parting thoughts?
No, just that I echo that. I think it's really a time of possibility and energy as much as it is a difficult time. And I hope we can all leverage that and make some positive changes.
Well, I mean, and Shell, what do you have to say?
Loads. I mean, I've had so many conversations over the last 2 months, maybe, with people who are just coming to the end of their undergraduate or graduate degrees. And that's either been through, design crits, or folks just having a chat over Zoom. And I'm so struck by the really, crap hand that they've been dealt. And I think, when they're graduating into a really uncertain job market, when the world's attention is sort of in many other places and not on sort of finding their first footsteps out there. But I think like you both, I feel hopeful. People are starting to realize that no one should ever be charged $50,000 to go to university. No teacher is worth that. No university should be founded on those principles. And I think this is sort of forcing a reckoning with some of the paradigms, at least in the US, and we talked about healthcare earlier, that just are deep seats of inequity. And I guess, I know that you're from Europe too, Paola, so we got to go to school for really cheap or free. And we had this wonderful education that was really open to most people. My mom didn't even finish high school. So the notion of being able to access some of these resources, healthcare as a human right, education as a human right, I think this moment in the US, I mean, I read the comment sections under fairly conservative commentators where people are finally thinking, healthcare shouldn't be tied to your employment. We should maybe be thinking about a single payer system. So I recognize the deep hurt and the loss of life that's happening right now as the predominant place that our attention should be, whether that's folks being murdered from police brutality, or folks losing their lives or livelihoods to the pandemic of COVID. But I also sense this moment as a tipping point, which is not that far away from sort of radical revolution, as far as I understand it, where people just, if you have everything taken away from you, whether that's a loved one through illness or through brutality, then there's really nothing left in terms of then seeking and demanding and asking for change. And so I think that's what we're seeing in terms of the unprecedented levels of activism. And my thought is always to amplify the folks who are doing the really amazing work and have been for decades before we were all here too, because it's not a new conversation by any means. So yeah, I'm with you in terms of listening to those generations who are really pioneering it and getting out of their way and sort of holding up their coattails as they go along and helping them in any way possible. But I have to say, both of your design practices inform the way in which I think about the world around me, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm so grateful for the hour and 9 minutes that you spent with us this evening, and to everyone in the comments who came along with us. We will put together the links that were mentioned and the resources that were mentioned, so we can send those out in an email when we say thank you for attending. Thank you to Dahlia, to Sophia and Elliot, who you can't see but are holding up the scenes behind the scenes. And
thank you to you, Shell.
Thank you very much. And I hope to see you all in real life very soon.
Oh, me too. Martini time.
Thank you to everyone. Good night.
Take care.
Thank you.